The goal of these seminars is to showcase examples of NOAA's leadership and impact environmental science by those who lead it and make it happen. I am Hernan Garcia, I'm with NOAA, and I'm your host for today. First, I would like to acknowledge the people who plan and organize these seminars and without whom none of these talks will happen. Sandra Clark, Administrative Office with NOAA Nestis, Katie Rowley, Outreach Librarian with NOAA Central Library and NOAA OAR, and Tracy Gill, Physical Scientist with NOAA's National Ocean Service, and who is retiring at the end of this month. She will be missed. Other NOAA staff have joined us in support of these webinars. We would like to thank Erica Dinteman with NOAA OER, who will moderate the questions following CO's seminar, and Robert Levy and Mike Shelby with NOAA's National Ocean Service and NOAA Studio, and the captioner with Federal Relay Captioning for making this webinar more accessible. Here, just a very few logistics. This seminar is being recorded for later viewing, and it will be made available in a few days. After this introduction, CO will present, and then we will take questions from the audience today. Online attendees may post their questions in the Adobe Connect Q&A at any time, and we will get to as many questions as we can. All attendees are muted. Today's seminar is titled Equity in Climate Science and Policy, and our speaker is Co Barrett, NOAA's Senior Advisor for Climate. Welcome, Co. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Hernan. Let's go to the next slide, because before I dive in, well, first let me say thank you, Hernan, and thank you to everyone else who's put together this seminar. And Tracy, so sorry to hear that you're retiring. You've been just such a stalwart on so many leadership activities across NOAA, but well-deserved. Okay, but before I dive in, I'd like to just share a little with you about my background, because today I'm going to be calling on experiences gained from each of the many roles that I've had a chance to play. So currently, I'm serving as NOAA's Senior Advisor for Climate, and this is a new role that Dr. Spinrad asked me to step into in order to help enable the agency to align, integrate, and extend its capabilities to best provide the climate services needed to address the climate challenge in the nation. So in this role, I'm very, very focused on knitting together the amazing climate-related capabilities we already have in place across every aspect of NOAA's mission space, and helping to create a more coordinated service delivery approach across NOAA. And we'll look to extend those capabilities. We established this role to help NOAA seize the unique opportunity we have right now at this time to make real, measurable progress on the climate challenge, as evidenced by the multitude of activities underway across the federal government and with our important partners. I also concurrently serve as Vice Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and I'll talk more about the IPCC later in this presentation, but briefly, for those of you who may not know, IPCC is the United Nations body for assessing the science related to climate change. And as Vice Chair, I'm part of the leadership team for that organization. Historically, I've held other roles. In NOAA, I was previously the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Policy for Programs and Administration in OAR, the research arm. I was a Deputy Director in the Climate Program Office. And before coming to NOAA, I was Director of the Global Climate Change Program at the U.S. Agency for International Development. Also, across those roles for about 15 years or so, I was a lead negotiator for the U.S. In the UN Climate Treaty, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. But actually, my most important role is mother for Finn, whose picture is on this slide. So you guys all get a chance to see my wonderful dog Finn. Okay, so I've had a long history of climate-related roles, and I'm really excited to share those experiences with you today. Let's go to the next slide. Today is International Women's Day. So when I found out this presentation was going to be on this day, I knew I couldn't just talk about climate change in isolation. I needed to link it to women and equity. So This year, the theme for International Women's Day is Gender Equality Today for a Sustainable Tomorrow, which perfectly illustrates how interconnected the issues of sustainability and equity are. And in my talk today, I'm going to take these issues into the climate realm and show you how climate and equity are deeply interconnected and must be addressed together to ensure real lasting resilience. So the idea of climate equity acknowledges that the impacts from climate change fall disproportionately on the most vulnerable. And so climate equity work aims to protect vulnerable and underserved populations and to provide appropriate balance in representation and access to resources. I know this can seem like a bit of an abstract idea. So today I plan to share a lot of this conversation in the context of real life experiences, drawing, on my work internationally and here at NOAA. So let's go to the next slide. I'm going to start today with the United Nations, and in particular, the UN climate change body that facilitates intergovernmental climate change negotiations and the implementation of international agreements. So this body organizes and supports the negotiating sessions each year. The largest and most important of these is the Conference of the Parties, held annually and hosted in different locations around the globe. You may have heard of this. It's referred to by its acronym, the COP. And it is the largest annual UN climate gathering anywhere, attended on average by around 25,000 participants. This body was established in 1992 as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. And the UNFCCC has near universal membership among countries. And it is the parent treaty to agreements I think you've probably heard about, like the Paris Agreement that we agreed to in 2015, and the Kyoto Protocol that was agreed to in 1997. Next slide. But it may, sorry, it's hard to read this slide, but it may surprise you to know equity issues were built right in at the start of these UN-sponsored climate negotiations. The UNFCCC, like many UN agreements, includes a provision for common but differentiated responsibilities, recognizing the fundamental difference between wealthy nations who have primarily caused the climate change problem through their release of greenhouse gas emissions, and poorer nations who have not contributed large amounts of greenhouse gases and are inherently more vulnerable to climate change. The common but differentiated responsibilities tenet has driven all of the commitments under climate negotiations, but it is really, really evident when you look at the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, where developed countries were required to take on binding emissions reduction targets, and developing countries did not have to take on targets. But interestingly, this distinction has become blurry in recent years, with China and India in the first and third places, respectively, among greenhouse gas emitters by country. The US is now second. And so it no longer really makes sense to exclude developing countries from commitments if a few are major contributors to the problem. Next slide. With that in mind, the negotiations took a very, very new turn with the Paris Agreement in 2015, because it really changed the landscape and asked all countries to make commitments. Now, not every country's commitments are equal, and these commitments are voluntary, but there is pressure exerted between countries to increase the ambition of their country targets over time. And it's really important that everyone is stepping up to do their part. And there's a really important aspect of this Paris Agreement approach, and that is in order to get all the countries to be willing to step up to take targets, we had to agree for developed countries to provide $1 billion per year to developing countries to assist them to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and build resilience to climate impacts as they develop. The negotiations are due to have a stock taking of progress towards meeting these goals in the next year, but a couple of things are clear. Developed countries have not met this financial agreement to provide $1 billion a year. And science is showing that all countries need to increase their ambition for greenhouse gas emissions reductions, because targets agreed under Paris will no longer hold temperature to the targets that countries are honing in on, which is trying to keep temperature between below 1.5 degrees C since pre-industrial times. So next slide. Here's just a couple of pictures from the most recent COP where climate equity issues were front and center. This is the COP that was held in Glasgow. And it was particularly concerned with remedying both of the aforementioned shortfalls, that is money and ambition. And many, many commitments were made at this conference and before to up the ambition, with multiple announcements to address methane, to reduce deforestation. There was a group of high ambition coalition countries. There were enhanced climate financing pledges, and many targets, including the US, revised our targets to be more ambitious. So less formally, for me, this COP also represented progress in involving a range of voices in the conversation. There is a stronger recognition, and it was really apparent at COP26, that the voices of students, of indigenous peoples, and all segments of civil society were really, really important to the conversation. So I participated in a couple of panels, just kind of as examples. One was what women bring to climate science, to discuss what women can bring to climate science and how we can further gender equality, increase diversity in science leadership. Also, I moderated a panel on the role of indigenous knowledge from a human rights perspective, which was super interesting and featured a number of indigenous representatives from across the world sharing the way that they are tackling the climate problem. But I just want to say, I think increased engagement can be instrumental in building the public connection to climate science and having everybody feel that their actions matter in this problem. So next slide. So this brings me to my first lesson learned from this presentation that I'd like to share with you, and that is, from the experience that I've had for 15 years as a climate negotiator and now as a participant in those meetings. And that is, although concerted global action is complex and constantly changing, we know that climate impacts are distributed unequally, and therefore equity considerations must be central to global climate conversations. Next slide. Okay, let's move on to IPCC, which is also within the UN system. In fact, IPCC science underpins the negotiations at the COPs. And the IPCC is the world's leading scientific authority on climate change, and it's the international body for assessing our state of knowledge on all things related to climate change. The organization was set up in 1988 to provide policymakers, governments, academia, and increasingly the general public with regular assessments of the impacts and risks of climate change and options for addressing it through mitigation, that is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or adaptation, that is building resilience. It was stood up at a time just when we were starting to discern that climate change was becoming a problem. So 1988 was just around the time when James Hansen was testifying to Congress and identifying the problem. Now, there were some earlier papers, really seminal papers, actually, including by NOAA's own Suki Manabe in 1967, where he basically determined what would happen, what would be the warming consequences of increasing CO2. And long overdue, he won the Nobel Prize for Physics just this last year. So super proud of Suki. All right, let's move on to the next slide. And let's talk a little bit about the power of consensus in the context of IPCC. So IPCC represents a unique collaboration of scientific expertise and political consensus. So the way it works is hundreds of scientists work together to produce IPCC reports. We don't do original research. Instead, our authors assess the scientific literature and distill the main findings and present this information to our global audience in the form of periodic assessment reports. And we put them out every 7 years or so. We put out a series of reports. And right now we're in the midst of putting out the assessment reports in our 6th cycle. Anyway, these authors donate their time over several years, and they volunteer to produce these reports on top of the full-time jobs that all of them hold. And in some cases, many of them are, parents of young children. So it's really, really an amazing volunteer effort. So we produce the drafts of the report, and then we engage in a collaborative process with expert reviewers and 195 countries to produce a final product that represents the consensus between all the partners. So we go through many rounds of review for each report, and we finally engage in an intense approval process where we produce a summary written in relatively plain language. We try to write it as plainly as we can for policymakers and the general audience. But we basically negotiate that summary word for word. And that's over 20 pages. And it takes us about 2 weeks when we're doing it virtually. I want to stress, because I think people have different views about this, but from my perspective, I want to stress that the partnership between governments and scientists is not a liability. I believe it is actually the greatest strength of the IPCC. Because by working closely with governments, the IPCC ensures that the information in our reports is useful in helping them to shape climate policy. But in providing policymakers with the best science, we give them the confidence to take science-driven action. And underlying all of this is the power in bringing diverse representatives together from all around the world. The consensus process creates the opportunity to raise the voices of people from all over, developed and developing countries, with a range of experiences, expertise, and backgrounds. Next slide, please. Especially appropriate today, I'd like to take a minute to share the work we're doing now to encourage geographic diversity and gender equality in the IPCC process. The percentage of women authors for IPCC reports has increased from well below 10% in the 1990s to around 30% today. It's progress, but it's slow. To facilitate faster progress, the IPCC recently adopted a gender policy and an implementation plan and established a gender action team, which I lead. And through this work, we're dedicated to mainstreaming gender in our work in an inclusive and respectful manner. But there is, where there is a balance in participation and all have equal opportunity. So for example, we're looking to provide a gender-friendly and inclusive environment when we select our meeting venues. We strive for gender balance on our panels and outreach events. And we organize regular opportunities for gender diversity training for our meeting chairs and facilitators. For us, a key part of this starts with encouraging countries to nominate women to serve as leaders or authors. Because if we don't improve the number of women who are nominated, we can't build a better overall representation. So nominations really are the start of it for us. As one of the first women serving as a vice chair of the IPCC, it really is my hope that this work helps each future IPCC assessment cycle to be more inclusive and supportive for people of all genders and scientists from all across the globe. And in fact, we're looking to increase the treatment of gender issues in our assessment reports. So this is crucial to all of our work, and I would argue the work of any organization striving to solve complex problems. So let's dive here a second. Think about this. Which do you think would be do a better job of presenting all sides of an issue or crafting enduring solutions? A team of people with similar backgrounds, coming from similar institutions, or people with diverse life experiences, trained at in different ways of thinking? Well, research shows us that we want the latter. We need the diversity if we want to overcome our limitations, especially our unconscious biases, and find solutions that benefit us all. Diversity and inclusion just makes for more robust solutions, and diverse representation sends the important signal that we are all welcome at the table. Next slide. So this kind of leads to my second lesson learned, which is diverse, inclusive, and representative processes produce powerful results. And I can testify, just serving as IPCC Vice-Chair, it really gives me a platform to advocate for inclusion and gender equality in science. And in this role, I have had the opportunity to meet with young scientists, and wherever I can, to encourage them to take leadership positions and to make their voices heard by sharing their expertise in their communities and universities, or on the international stage where people can see them and relate and say, this is a possibility for me. So next slide. I just want to talk and kind of end up this talk with a conversation about what's happening here at NOAA. So you can see here on this slide the three main priorities under this administration. So they are climate, balance between environmental stewardship and economic development, and equity. So you can kind of see it's of utmost importance to the role that I now hold to bring the climate equity issue together with the climate work that we do across the agency. And as we at NOAA look to contribute to the all of society and all of government approach to tackling the climate crisis, we, being the primary authoritative source for climate products and services, have made commitments to exhibit equity in how we build and provide services, promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in our own workforce, and provide equitable access to our products and services. NOAA's data and information can help people make science-based decisions, especially at the local level where planning for an uncertain future is the most difficult decision that people can make. And they often need technical support. And that's why NOAA is working every day to ensure that every community has access to the accurate weather and climate information they need to make decisions and adapt to the impacts of climate change. One way NOAA has been doing this work lately is through the hosting of climate and equity roundtables. These are roundtables that help us to understand how we can better serve the vulnerable and underserved communities. So what we do is we convene roundtables across the country to receive feedback and recommendations directly from local stakeholders and organizations and communities that kind of help us to see how NOAA policies, products, and services can better meet their needs. And in particular, how we can better meet the needs of historically marginalized communities. These roundtables support NOAA's broader focus on integrating equity fully into our operations and workforce. And this broader focus aligns well with a new and developing climate vision. You may have heard a little bit about it. We're really just working on it, and we hope to kind of get the word out more fully. Something we're calling the Climate Ready Nation Initiative, which has targets going all the way out to 2030 that kind of align our work to providing better climate services to the nation. If you listened into Dr. Spinrad's testimony earlier today, he talked a lot about that. And what it is it's a vision of a climate-ready nation thriving, a thriving nation whose prosperity, health, safety, and continued growth benefit from a shared understanding of and collective action on climate change. So the idea of this initiative is to target service delivery to communities across the U.S., support other members of the federal government in climate proofing their investments, which is really important right now where we've got a lot of infrastructure spending, and to work with businesses in the private sector to enable a robust public-private service delivery enterprise. A piece of this too will be to continue to advance our efforts to create a climate literate public empowered to take action in their own lives and spheres of influence. And many of you are probably familiar with the climate.gov website. You know, this is just plain language speak for folks who want to understand what's happening with the climate. But most importantly here, NOAA is building a climate-ready nation through a lens of equity to ensure that the agency fully meets its mission to benefit all Americans. You know, too often we fall short in meeting the needs of underserved communities, and we believe we have to strengthen these efforts. So next slide. So the lesson learned from this part, the NOAA work, is equal access to data, products, and services in all communities is really essential if we're going to transform society through climate decisions, climate actions, and outcomes. Next slide, and actually one of the last. So look, when you bring all of these lessons together, I think it's easy to see that pursuing climate equity benefits everyone. I believe one of the most important factors in our future success is how we embrace and incorporate diverse perspectives and viewpoints and experiences as we chart our future course. And considering equity has to be at the center. The point is, our challenges are complex and require the best, most innovative minds to be engaged. And we must consider the needs and perspectives of all if we are to succeed in keeping life on this planet livable for all of us. So with that, I'll just thank you all. The last slide is just a thank you, I think. And I will turn it over to Erica, who I think will be fielding the questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Co. Thank you for that great presentation. So as Co said, we'll be taking a few questions from the audience. So please do feel free to add your questions into the question box, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. So just to kick us off, Co, I know many of us saw a new report come out from the IPCC just last week. Could you speak to whether that report speaks to equity issues at all, and if so, how it does?
Oh my gosh, great question. Yes, it absolutely does. For those of you who don't know, the report that came out last week was focused on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And these topics intersect with equity in so many ways. So for instance, the report sheds light on how climate change interacts with global trends such as unsustainable use of natural resources, growing urbanization, social inequities, and a whole bunch more. And the assessment shows that tackling all these different challenges will require involving everyone, especially traditionally marginalized people, including women, young people, old people, indigenous people. And there's a lot of information in the report on this. We also have a figure in the summary for policymakers, which among other things, assesses climate responses and adaptation options for observed benefits or disbenefits for gender equality in low-income groups. So yeah, there's a lot of information in there. And I guess maybe I should mention that report in particular had about 40% of all of its authors, over 260, but 40% of them were women. So because that report focuses very much on impacts and vulnerability and brings in a lot of the social science, it is a report where we have better gender representation.
That a little bit too. I have a question from Timothy here who asks that it seems like gender in the IPCC world means women and men. Is there an effort to actively engage the LGBTQ community and the ways that that community is uniquely impacted, or the unique perspective that those genders can bring to the UN and NOAA climate work? So your thoughts on that?
That's a really great question. And I mean, where possible, we use wording like for all genders in recognition that we do need to think beyond the binary male-female way of thinking about genders. But honestly, we need to work harder on that. I think the UN system is sometimes hampered by the fact that when we are driving to consensus, not every country is as embracing of LGBTQ plus issues. And but certainly in the IPCC, we're very focused on that, and I'm really glad you raised that question.
And specifically leveraging your influence to increase diversity, inclusiveness, and equity where you can. Could you give us an example of what that looks like?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's interesting because when I became DAA for OAR, I have to confess, gender issues were not front and center for me. I like many women was making my way through my career based on my accomplishments and hoping to be recognized as someone who was capable and able to do the jobs that I was selected to do. But it really became clear to me that with the number of requests that I got for mentoring conversations or even just presentations, that there's a real hunger for people to see people like themselves in leadership positions and to better understand how they too can take these positions. And so it's actually transformed my work, honestly, because I learned so much from those conversations, and I now recognize it's important for me to advocate for these issues so that people feel more comfortable striving to have positions in leadership or scientific positions. And I'll share one thing that has kind of come out of a lot of these conversations, because often, and I'm speaking from a gender perspective here, but I think it also matters for geographic diversity. But from a gender perspective for the moment, often we as women hold ourselves back from taking positions because it just doesn't seem like we can do that job like the person before us did it. But often we overlook the idea or the fact that we can do the job differently. I'll speak from my perspective. I hold these high scientific positions. I have a bachelor's degree in environmental science. I'm not a PhD. And so there were plenty of times in my career where I could have held myself back and said, oh, I can't do that. I don't have a PhD. But instead, I've been fortunate in that I've been able to say, I don't have a PhD. Okay. Are we at a meeting where you need the in the weeds ideas or facts that come from understanding, the nuts and bolts of science? I'm going to bring that person to the table. And as a leader, I can do that. I don't have to embody all the qualities. I just have to be able to lead and bring those qualities to the table. And often that's a better approach, honestly. It's a more inclusive approach. It gives me the opportunity to bring to the table someone who may not naturally be sitting there, who has so much to offer.
If we know that developed countries fell short of following through on the monetary commitments they agreed to in 1997 and beyond, he asks, what makes the new, more ambitious commitments any different? Also notes that diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts struggle with the same thing, as there is often much committed to or promised that is ultimately not delivered. So both kind of what makes these commitments any different, and then also who is responsible for enforcing these commitments.
Let me take the last part of that first. So the commitments are voluntary, right? And so that, that there is no coercion in the climate negotiation world. People take on these commitments, and as I said, there's a lot of pressure on everybody to kind of meet your commitments and do it one better. But it isn't, there's no binding compliance regime. Still, there has been progress made through the voluntary commitments of the Paris Agreement. So I don't think it's without teeth. It does have power. And if you were paying attention to the news leading up to the COP26, you would have seen many, many, many promises and commitments to put money to the table, to advance climate action in a multitude of ways. But you're right. I mean, if the commitments are not followed through on, then that the whole problem is kind of a house of cards that falls down. But I'll say this: I've been working on climate for over 20 years, and I've never actually seen a time like this where so many are coming to the table with solutions. And it's not just governments. And we know in our country that, we can go from one administration to another and have a very different commitment to climate that is either very ambitious or not. And so relying only on governments, I think is potentially, not the path to a real solution. But where I'm encouraged is, and I said this a little bit in the presentation, I'm encouraged by the voices that are being heard and that are pushing for action, especially young folks who are very well informed on science and who are really pushing for action. And they are the ones who are going to be sitting in our seats very shortly, kind of moving society towards solution. So I'm really encouraged by that. But, I'll just use one small example of where I see real change happening, because let's face it, if we're going to actually address this problem in the next couple decades, we've got to be transforming society right now. And so that means the private sector as well. And it was really interesting at the COP, there were a couple of US car companies that made commitments that went far beyond what the US itself was making in terms of commitments for electric cars. And if anybody watched the Super Bowl, and I'm not a big football fan, but I watched the Super Bowl, every other car commercial was an electric car commercial. And, for me, that's mainstreaming this issue. And I hear more and more people who are, looking to buy their next car is an electric car, and the infrastructure is going in place. And, cars are a major part of the greenhouse gas emissions that come out of our country. So if we can shift to electric cars and power those cars with renewable energy, we're really making a difference in the trajectory of our greenhouse gas emissions.
IPCC in terms of becoming more inclusive?
Yeah, it's a the answers could go in a number of different directions. As I said, just getting countries to nominate women is a hurdle, but we're tackling that, and we're really focused on that for the next assessment cycle. But you know, a real benefit of the process is having so many developing country scientists who are a part of the process. And, you know, we really need to up our game on bringing in scientists who come to the table and fully participate. And that means making sure that we get them into the process, but also that we train ourselves up to be able to make sure that we are culturally sensitive enough to make sure that people have the chance to speak, to contribute. Because, you know, I mean, we know this from science, even in our own country. You know, there are some pretty heavy hitters in the science world who are very comfortable speaking and leading and taking charge. But we all need to have a greater cultural sensitivity and recognize that there are some who, you know, speak more softly, or, you know, may not have that kind of confidence in an international setting, and we have to make the place for that, and we have to be trained up so that we're all paying attention to being inclusive and being supportive. And I think that will help us go a much longer way. And we're doing a whole survey of everybody who took place this assessment cycle, or who participated this assessment cycle, to get a greater understanding of ways we can improve on that, and to set us up to implement that for the next cycle that starts next year.
Make in our data dissemination in order to meet the needs of underserved communities? And what more do we need to do as an agency to realize our vision for equitable climate product and service delivery? Your thoughts?
Yeah, that's great. It's a great question, or a combination of questions. So, you know, I think across the board, we have tremendous data stores that we are not getting into the hands of users in the form that they need. Now, I'm not saying that across the board, because there are plenty of folks who work with us who are very happy about the services we're providing. But when we look at a nation of 30,000 communities, all of whom need to consider climate in one form or fashion, we really need to be reaching other federal agencies who are spending so much money on infrastructure, reaching you know, all aspects of society and governments at the state and local level with the climate information they need tailored to their specific problems and priorities. And, you know, that is clearly something that we can work on in terms of streamlining access to our information. And we've got this really exciting new initiative underway, which is called the Climate Resilience Information System, where we'll be working to create kind of data access points. And I stress the points because it has to come in through normal avenues for getting information. So if you are a farmer, you would probably, you know, access it through the Department of Agriculture, and we're working with other federal agencies to create this kind of pooled set of data that and resources that people can access from, you know, whichever way they would come to the information. But honestly, we need just a whole pool of practitioners who are working with communities, with decision makers, to point them to the information, to work with them to develop the tools, to help them to implement changes, and importantly, to feed that information back to us or to other federal partners so that we can improve our ability to kind of serve them. It's an important loop to keep in place. And that's going to require, you know, all kinds of, you know, like a whole army of practitioners who need to be trained up, who can do this. Now there are some interesting ideas out there. I don't know what's going to happen with them in terms of legislative action on the Hill, but one of them was this Climate Conservation Corps, which was going to be very much focused on underserved communities. And the idea there would be to find people in communities, to train them up and to work within their communities. And why is that important? It's really clear from our experience in providing climate services for a couple of decades now that it is really important to have trusted members of communities involved in the climate conversation. If strangers come into this conversation and tell people what to do from a climate perspective, we find this also from UN bodies. Not every community in the US is open to hearing messages from UN officials about what they should be doing in their lives. But members of communities who know people, who know the priorities, are so effective in helping to get climate information into the hands of folks who need it. But we'll also be doing other things. I mean, we're hoping to target some grant programs specifically to underserved. There's some really interesting climate science citizen science activities where we engage with communities to work with them to develop science. Some of urban areas where the poorest people live are often really a whole lot hotter than other parts of the city. Working with them to kind of tackle those issues, create shade, deal with the heat island effect. There's just a whole bunch of things that we're working to do, and there's a whole of government effort focused on climate justice, which is remarkable. It's the first time it's ever happened here in the U.S. So I'm really hopeful that real on the ground change is going to happen.
For our climate efforts, and particularly talk about our collaboration with developing countries?
Yeah, Renata, great question. It's really clear that U.S. leadership on climate change has got to involve leadership working with developing countries. That those resources that need to flow to developing countries is essential to the entire implementing the entire climate solution. So at the last COP, the president announced a $3 billion a year initiative focused on building resilience and assisting adaptation in developing countries. It's called the Prepare Initiative, prepare as in prepare the word. And it's kind of a collaborative effort between AID and state, who have a strong international portfolio, obviously, but also us and the Department of Treasury and the Development Finance Corporation. And we hope other federal agencies who have resources or tools to bring to the table to help developing countries adapt and build resilience to climate change. And I think the approach here is very much going to be to kind of take their lead in what they have identified as their priorities. So countries have adaptation plans. They have regular communications to the negotiations that kind of highlight their priority needs. And the idea would be to kind of work with these countries to follow their lead, and then to bring resources to the table that help them to better understand how the climate is likely to change in their area, to bring tools to the table that work here in the US and can probably work there if they're adapted to the situation. So that's just kind of one example, the Prepare initiative that I'll share for now. I have some thoughts on that. We need to do a better job. And we can't just say it's because we're a science agency, because that's not a good enough answer. There are other science agencies that do a better job of recruiting a diverse, workforce. The good news is we recognize the problem and we're working hard on it. Part of the challenge, honestly, is just getting our hiring to happen in any kind of reasonable time frame. Because think about it, if it takes you 6 months to hire somebody, people who are, who are in a situation where they just can't wait to hear are moving on and not waiting for NOAA to come to the table. So improving the time span of these kind of, start to finish on these hiring actions is a good step forward. Honestly, I think the pandemic has obviously showed that we can work remotely, at least in part, and still get the work done. And I think there's an equity component to that as well, because if you don't have to be located in the Washington, D.C. area in order to do this work, that gives us the opportunity to access folks who live in other parts of the country and to probably bring in a more diverse workforce. So we're looking at that. I think there's important lessons to be learned there. We're doing also some things, I know we in OAR, and I think it's true in some of the other line offices, where we're trying to address unconscious bias by actually stripping applications of any identifying information that would indicate, say the gender or the background of an applicant. And we're also really bringing in diverse panels. So think about this, like you're not just bringing the same subject matter experts to the table evaluating a candidate. Let's bring in a diversity of perspectives so that we're looking at the candidate from in different ways to better understand the whole of the person and what they can contribute. And I've been a part of panels in OAR that have been very focused on that, and it's been tremendously valuable to help check your own unconscious biases in the selecting process. Potent motivators for genuine action. I think the most potent motivator for genuine action is having an understanding about how things are changing where you live or places you care about, and using that as motivation to take action. So I'll just share a personal story. I have roots in the mountains of Western North Carolina. And, this last IPCC report that just came out a week ago, there's entire maps about biodiversity in the US and where the biodiversity hotspots are. And those places are largely like the California coast and in the Southeast. And in particular, the Appalachian Mountains are, a hotspot for biodiversity. I could look at that map and say, oh my gosh, like biodiversity in the place that I care about is really rich. And yet this report also tells me how it's threatened and what we can do, what kinds of adaptations we can put in place to protect that biodiversity. That makes it real for me. And I think, one of the things that's really helped in this IPCC assessment cycle this time is we're really talking about the next couple of decades. It keeps coming up in all the science that we put forward. Every fraction of a degree of warming matters, and every action helps. And that makes this very real. It's not some future problem of invisible greenhouse gases going out into the end of the century, it's really right now. And when you start to think about climate in that way, you start to look at all the little ways in your own life where you can just make a change. I'm not going to dictate what that is for other people. And obviously, individual change is not going to be enough because we need really big transformational change across society. But it's also true that individual action actually really matters. And the little things that we can do contribute to the solution, but importantly, it just keeps our hope up. And it just keeps us like working and moving forward. And I believe it starts to snowball. And I'm obviously an optimist. I've been working on climate change for over 20 years, but I think it really matters. I think if we could start to just take the changes in our life that we can do, it'll start to lead to other changes, and we can start to have the conversations with our neighbors, and then it starts to snowball, and we, pretty soon we see society transforming in ways that are like really amazing. And this isn't just, kind of wishful thinking. Look at what's been happening with renewable energy over the last decade. It's really come down in price. I mean, I can just pay a few extra pennies a kilowatt hour and get all my electricity in the house sourced by wind. Our next cars can very much be electric cars. So things are changing, but I think, thinking about the things you care about and using that as a motivation for action is really powerful.
Well, thank you so much, Erica, and thank you, Cole, for speaking with us today. Very informative. Again, thank you to all who make this NELS webinars possible. Our next seminar will be April 12th, featuring a panel of diverse NOAA employees discussing professional excellence at NOAA, a diversity of perspectives. Thank you so much for joining us. Goodbye.